In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Russian Revolution of 1917. And the first thing we're going to look at is some background on events leading up to the 1917 revolutions. First, we're going to be looking at the 1905 revolution, which was essentially sparked by the events of Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday is an event in which imperial soldiers fired on a mass of protesters, a large group of protesters, and this resulted in nationwide protest as well as soldier mutinies. During the chaos of the 1905 revolution, a council of workers created the St. Petersburg Soviet. This later would become the Petrograd Soviet and helped lay the groundwork for other revolutionary movements that led up to the 1917 revolutions. Also, in response to the 1905 revolution, amongst all the political upheaval and calls for changes to Russia's government, led to the creation of what was called a Duma, or a parliament, and this would later form the provisional government that would follow the 1917 revolutions. Russian citizens were facing very hard times. For one, they were losing in a war which many did not have much of a stake in. A lot of the Russians didn't necessarily view the Germans as their enemy. It didn't help that Russia had only recently been industrialized, and their military capabilities could not match Germany or the other industrial powers at the time. Russia was still a somewhat, for lack of a better word, backwards country. The serfs had only been freed within the last century. So there was a very poor population in Russia, and many of them worked in overcrowded cities and urban environments that were cramped. They were not sanitary in a lot of cases. Housing was overcrowded, and they were working very long, hard days, working close to 10-hour days, 6 days a week. And as time went on, by 1916, many people were working 11 to 12 hours a day. There was lots of risk for injury or even death because of the poor safety and sanitary conditions. They weren't given adequate wages, and there had been massive inflation during the war. The cost of living had gone up while wages continued to stay the same. Tsar Nicholas II was becoming much more unpopular as he took the blame for the poor state of Russia at the time. It did not help that he also took over control of the Russian military. So as they continued to not perform very well during the war, he took more of the blame for their loss. So many were unhappy with the authoritarian rule of the Tsar, as you might imagine. And there were many who wanted democratic participation in government. Ideas from the Enlightenment were popular, especially among Russian intellectuals. And there were lots of liberals and populists, Marxists, anarchists, that were all kind of at least supporting democratic reforms of some kind. Whether or not they agreed on all those things, obviously they've had very different ideas on how these should be done. But So now we'll jump ahead to 1917, starting with the February Revolution, which began in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg. At the beginning of February, people were participating in strikes and demonstrations. So on March the 7th, 1917, the largest industrial plant in Petrograd, it was called Putilov, was closed down because the workers were striking. The next day was International Women's Day, and there was more rallies, meetings. This turned into basically political gatherings. There were also food shortages going on at the time. A lot of people were protesting for not just better working conditions and better pay, but just to simply be fed. And a couple days later, by March the 10th, pretty much every industrial plant in Petrograd had been shut down. People were in the streets and at public gatherings trying to enact political change of some kind. The Tsar did try to put down the riots and protests that were breaking out. The soldiers were reluctant to move in on this crowd, partly because there were so many women in the crowd. And when they were ordered to suppress the rioting, many of the soldiers revolted. Many of them didn't actually join the rioting, however, they just went into hiding or they were shot. And they were essentially unable to hold back the chaos and the protests and the riots that were breaking out. Interestingly, that morning, Nicholas had gotten rid of the Duma, essentially the only democratic institution within Imperial Russia. And the parliamentary members essentially responded by creating a temporary committee to try to restore law and order. Meanwhile, socialist parties in Petrograd established the Petrograd Soviet in order to represent the workers and soldiers. And many of the remaining loyal troops, loyal citizens, were switching their allegiance to the Petrograd Soviet. On March 15th, Tsar Nicholas II would abdicate, and a provisional government formed under Prime Minister Prince Lvov. From here, there's a lot more you could talk about, but I'm kind of just going to go briefly over the next few things that happen. Essentially, you have the October Revolution. Lenin would arrive in Petrograd around April, but he would actually be in exile, or he would be in hiding during the October Revolution. But we essentially see we have an armed insurrection, and the Bolsheviks are essentially taking more revolutionary action in Petrograd. The Bolsheviks eventually win the majority in the Petrograd Soviet. And from here on, we essentially have the Bolshevik factions and the anti-Bolshevik factions coming to a head. And from here on, the civil war in Russia essentially catapults from this moment, where we have the Red Army working on behalf of the Bolsheviks and the White Army fighting on behalf of people who were essentially anti-Bolshevik or pro-monarchy in some cases, people who were not in favor of the revolutionary tactics of the Bolsheviks. The Allied forces in World War I eventually end up helping the White Army, and the war results in the Red Army winning, the Bolsheviks taking power. The Bolsheviks would essentially become the Communist Party, and then we have the formation of the Soviet Union under Lenin. There's a lot you could go into. about the dual power systems of the competing provisional government and the Soviets. We could talk about the Civil War in great detail. We could also talk about Lenin, but we're going to basically highlight just a few things about the Bolshevik rise to power. We're going to be looking at two primary sources real fast. The first one is the picture of Comrade Lenin sweeps the globe clean. And this was a essentially cartoon, a kind of propaganda piece that was earlier on in the revolution. As you can see, Lenin is a bit more of a cartoony kind of depiction, and he's not just sweeping Russia clean, he's sweeping the entire world clean of the clergy and monarchy and capitalists. So as you can see, Lenin had already gained some popularity early on in the revolutions, but as you would see later on, the propaganda pieces were much less cartoony depictions and much more serious. And Lenin was obviously becoming a much more revered person. He was being seen more and more as the leader of the revolution, and of course he would eventually lead the Soviet Union. And of course the formation of the Soviet Union and Lenin's death after suffering from several strokes would of course lead to Stalin, World War II, the Cold War. We could go into how the revolution influenced all these further events, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave it at this. Thank you for watching this video.